where we are going to come up with a list of the actual powers of the president. So the first box is your formal powers. Formal means I can open up to Article 2, Section 2, and they're there. Like, I can find them. So it means this is the framers' intent for the presidency. They are expressly written down. The first thing that it says is that the president shall take care to faithfully execute the laws. Under the Articles of Confederation, if you'll remember, we didn't have this. So we had a legislature that could make laws, but we didn't have anybody that could make sure they got carried out. Well, that's just asinine. Like, you need somebody to actually enforce what you've done. So that's the chief job of the president, not to create law, not to tell us what to do, but to carry out whatever the elected legislature has done. The president is also in charge of the military. And there's a lot of misconceptions here. Being in control of the military means that the president can decide with his advisors military action. If there's some kind of military crisis going on in the world and the president says we're getting involved, he alone makes that decision. And he has, the modern president has a National Security Council, and they have all these advisors, and, on TV you see them in the Situation Room, and they're trying to make decisions. And ultimately the president is the one that decides that. If we want to drop a bomb, it is the American president alone in this country that possesses the power to drop a nuclear warhead on somebody. Like, that's it. Like, only him. That's a lot of power for one person. But then you've got to step back and think about, okay, what did they mean in 1787? So the president was in charge of the military, but remind me, what military power does Congress have?
Declare war.
Right. So declaration of war, if you think about it, in 1787, I would suspect that our framers thought that Congress would have to be on board with whatever the president wanted to do. Because if he was going to go engage in military action, he would go to them to get a declaration of war. The difference is that in modern times, we engage in war and we don't call it war. We just have military action. Technology has changed war tremendously. The fact that we have all these secret CIA and FBI, and we have all these police, these federal police that are doing all this federal work. There's a lot of war-ish kind of behavior without this formal declaration of war. Yes, ma'am?
So the president does the FBI and all that stuff?
They all ultimately fall under the president, yes.
But the Congress is the one that declares actual war?
Mhm.
When's the last time that happened?
World War II?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Doesn't it correlate to nuclear power? It's like once the president has dropped nuclear war, I don't know. I think it just made it super irrelevant. So this is a place where the American president, though, can really assert a lot of authority. And we're going to talk about the controversy around this next class. Why would it be important that the president is a civilian, do you think? That they're not a military person?
So that way, the citizens can control the military, not the military itself.
Why would it be concerning to have the military in charge of the military?
Because then they can they can overthrow everything if they wanted to. They have the knowledge to do that, whereas a civilian doesn't know exactly about everything, but the military can do all that knowledge.
Yeah, absolutely. You don't want the military in charge of themselves. History tells us that's a bad idea. All right, the president negotiates treaties. If you were going to make an agreement with a foreign head of state, then it is the president's job to negotiate that. That doesn't mean the treaty is put in place. Which president negotiated the League of Nations just to have the Senate say no?
Woodrow Wilson.
Very good. Just imagine what that's like. I mean, to be the leader of America, to sit down with foreign heads of states, negotiate something like that, and then to have your legislature say no. That's a really powerful tool of the Senate, to say no to our executive. That doesn't happen in a lot of countries, but it shows you again that that's really our framers felt. To have a democratic form of government, you had to have a legislature with those kind of checks on your executive. This one you guys obviously know. The president can veto or sign bills. The president also has the power to call Congress into special session. Okay, that's not so relevant today because Congress works most of the time. But if you go back to the very beginning, we didn't have this full-time legislature that was always there. So if our congressmen had gone home back to do their regular jobs and be with their families, and there were some kind of crisis and the president needed them to come back, he could do that. So it just kind of shows you that the president probably needed them for whatever action he was going to take. The other thing is it says that the president has to advise Congress on the state of the union. So that means what's going on in the country. Our early presidents issued wrote a letter, and it would be a letter that they would send, and that would say they want to suggest legislation. This is what we hope the Congress will do. President Wilson was the first one to go and actually give a speech where both chambers of Congress would be together. And then obviously with television it's changed a lot. But every February, since Wilson, every president has gone and they've delivered the speech. So technically our new president, they don't have to do a speech. They could just send a letter. I suspect that would be a little bit odd. It's kind of become part of our unwritten constitution that it is a speech, but that is his formal opportunity to suggest legislation and say, this is what I want you to do. The president has the ability to welcome and receive ambassadors. So somebody comes here from Mexico or Canada or China or an African country, wherever they come to America, he has to welcome them if there's somebody that we have a relationship with. He also has the job to appoint with Senate consent people to be ambassadors in other nations. So our representatives. This power of recognition you probably haven't learned much about because it's not something that's utilized a whole lot. But there's certain parts of the world or there's certain countries that we have relationships with, and there's some that we don't. Well, imagine that there's some kind of coup, and there's a civil war, and countries their borders change. One country splits into two, or one country takes over another country. Well, it's the American president's decision whether or not we recognize them as a legitimate sovereign nation. That's a big deal, because that's going to forge a lot of history. So the very best example I know of that is President Nixon going to China. So you guys will think back to world history. Remember that China was not, the nationalists were the people that were in charge of China, and then the communists decided to take over. Remember Mao led the communist revolution, and there was fighting, and they pushed the nationalists back to Taiwan, right? And so then now we have communist China. President Nixon was the first American president to go, and he went, and it was a big media tour. There was all these stage things, like him playing ping pong with people and taking a tour. But you guys, it is such a monumental time in history. There is an opera written called Nixon in China, because what he did is he's saying that Nixon hated communism, but what he's saying is this is a big, powerful nation in an important part of the world, and we need to establish a relationship with them. So we're going to agree to disagree, but they're okay. They can exist. They need to leave Taiwan alone, right? They need to stick to their borders and their boundaries, and there's certain things we expect them to do. But imagine if he hadn't. I'm told that you could still go places in China and see big pictures of Mao and big pictures of Nixon, because it was where that link started to become between our two countries. So pretty big deal. The president also possesses judicial powers. That's what clemency means. So if somebody is accused of a federal crime, or they have been convicted of a federal crime, the president can actually check that. So a pardon is like a get out of jail free card. So if Michael is charged with bank robbery, which is a federal crime, President Obama can pardon him, which says, you know what, there were extenuating circumstances, and his senioritis really got to him, so we're not going to let him be charged. A reprieve. Let's say that Michael does in fact get tried, so there was no pardon, and he gets sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. And the new president is like, you know what, that's a little bit ridiculous. Yes, we know that that's what the sentence was supposed to be, but the court didn't take into consideration all these factors, so we're going to shorten his sentence down to 5 years. So that's a reprieve. If my whole class loses their mind and robs a bank, President Obama could issue amnesty, which would be legal forgiveness to all of you. So it's like a pardon for a big group, and it says, you know what, things happen, we're sorry, you're sorry, let's just start fresh. Okay?
But it's not stuff as simple as robbing a bank, right? It's bigger.
Well, no. It has to fall under federal law, and really most criminal activity is state crimes, like murder and things like that. Robbing a bank is a federal crime, so that's why I use that as an example.
Didn't Ford pardon Nixon?
Ford did. Okay, so President Nixon could potentially have been accused of some criminal activity. So this isn't about his impeachment. But there was some breaking and entering into federal buildings, there was some wiretapping. So there were things that would have violated federal law if he was convicted. So Ford pardoned him, which basically said he cannot be tried. President Reagan issued an amnesty executive order where they issued, I don't know if it's an executive order or maybe it was a law that Congress passed. Well, no, it had to be an executive order because it was amnesty. So he granted amnesty to a large group of illegal immigrants at the time, back in the 80s. And what that meant was, if you came here illegally, but you're here, you're living a good life, you're obeying by the law, you're doing everything you're supposed to do, we're not going to deport you, and we're not going to prosecute you. We're going to ask that you come in and you follow the appropriate steps so that we can legalize you, and then we're going to tighten up our borders. And President Obama has talked about the same kind of thing. People that dodged the draft during Vietnam and didn't follow their draft orders were granted amnesty, and they said, just come back. We're not going to, Vietnam's over, it was unpopular, we won't prosecute you. Stuff like that. What do you think of those kind of powers?
I don't mind. I think they're okay.
Think it's okay?
I mean, if he's the strongest person in the country, I think he has powers like this.
Anybody see a problem with?
Well, he could abuse it and do stuff like that, but doesn't have to if they do that, then public opinion will probably affect them very negatively.
So when might you pardon someone then?
Right before you end your
Oh, yeah.
your
So we should pay attention. Many presidents use the last couple months of their presidency to use this power. So we'll see what happens.
Can you only do it a certain amount of times?
All right, and then the last one is that our president has appointment power. The Constitution only created a president and a vice president under the executive branch. But there is some language in there that says there will be executive officers. So from the very beginning, Washington had those. Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, Secretary of the Treasury. That has evolved into all these cabinet positions, regulatory agencies, and the American president gets to appoint those. Again, with Senate confirmation, but he still gets to appoint them. All federal judges are also to be appointed by the president. We're seeing that right now. We have a vacancy on the Supreme Court. President Obama has made a nomination. We're waiting for the Senate Judiciary Committee to start hearings, so we're kind of stuck in that place. But know, too, there's lots of other federal judges. You have Supreme Court, you have circuit courts, you have district courts. There are thousands of federal judges in America. The reality is the American president can't make all those appointments. So there is a concept out there, and you need to know this, it's called senatorial courtesy. So senatorial courtesy. So what senatorial courtesy is, because the Senate approves judicial appointments, we allow senators to directly influence the appointment of federal judges that are going to fall within their state borders. So if you think, in Texas, we have federal courts that are housed in Texas. There's one in Plano. If you drive down Preston Road and you go, if you're heading to Plano and you go, past where Payway and all that is, there's on the, I guess that was the east side. On the east side, there's a big kind of gray courthouse. That's a federal court. Well, when they built that, the president would have to appoint federal judges and the Senate would have to confirm them. So what we do is we allow our senators to kind of decide who those people are going to be. And you still could have a hearing, you could still have a filibuster, you could still have a huge political deal. So I'm not saying it's a given, it's a rule. So it could totally change. But I don't know, it's just kind of it's a way of expediting things. And if the president makes an appointment that the Texas senator is oh my gosh, no way, then we also kind of allow them to basically kind of push that person aside. What that does is you kind of find that federal judges tend to reflect the ideology of their area of the country more than they do sometimes even the president. So we're going to have probably more conservative federal judges in the South, regardless of